Hello, hello, hello. Well, first off, I just wanted to say thank you to everyone for having me here, for Ian for inviting me. It's really an honor to be here speaking to you all and to be able to sit in on all these great talks and to be able to take this information and learning back to Square Enix as a whole. I also need to say that I got in just yesterday, and unfortunately, I'm a little jet lagged right now. So I apologize if the caffeine didn't quite kick in yet. So I apologize if you can tell. Hopefully you can't. Okay, so first up, a little bit about me. So I'm Meagan Marie. I'm the Senior Community and Social Media Manager at Crystal Dynamics. I was previously at Game Informer, and when I first started working at Game Informer, that's when I first found an interest in accessibility. And that was, I would write about it in articles, and I did some talks at various usability groups when I was at the magazine. And for me, the interest has always just been tied to empathy. You know, I love games and I want everyone to be able to enjoy games the way that I do. And so now I've been at Crystal Dynamics since 2011. I've launched 7 Tomb Raider Lara Croft games while I've been there. And now I'm working on the Avengers project, which is really exciting, but I can't talk about it at all other than to say those words, so sorry. Also, I am an author, and I really, really like Tomb Raider. I wrote a book about it. So I wrote 20 Years of Tomb Raider in 2016, and I just finished a book literally like last week called Women in Gaming, 100 Professionals of Play. And the reason I brought it up is because we have 2 accessibility advocates in it, including Cherry. She is profiled as one of the 100 women, so yay for Cherry. Okay, so before I get into Shadow of the Tomb Raider and the accessibility features from that, I actually wanted to do a little walk through the history of Tomb Raider, and not the entire history, trust me, I could go on forever about that, but how accessibility and just options and gameplay options have been a part of the franchise. So the first Tomb Raider was actually was released in 1996, and it was developed by Core Design. Core Design was based out of Derby in the UK, and there weren't really, in the first 5 Tomb Raider games, and you can see the box art pictured here. They were released 1996 through 2000 yearly. It was quite a push by the team to get them out every year. They didn't really have explicit accessibility options. They did have the option to adjust the sound effects and music independent of one another. They had multiple preset controller configurations, lock-on aim. Once the DualShock was introduced, they did have the option to turn vibration on and off. And I guess a lot of people don't really think about this as an accessibility feature, but Croft Manor was actually a really, really great safe space for people to run around in. It was considered a tutorial area. And I know a lot of people who were maybe younger at the time used it as a safe space to learn traversal moves or learn combat moves, and that was something that made the game more accessible. I think I ran around in Croft Manor almost as much as I did anywhere else in the game. But the games were actually very difficult, if you remember them. They required precise traversal. They have very quickly timed puzzles. If you've played them, you probably remember dashing for a door and skirting, trying to get under it at the last minute. And the early ones especially, they had a really punishing save system that involved crystals. So they were not the most accessible, but there were some features that were helpful at the time. So just as an aside, some of these slides have a lot of text on them. The ones that are grayed out are features that have carried over. You don't need to read all of these. It's just I'm adding the newer ones, so the ones that are interesting, so you can kind of see how more accessibility was added with each game. So Angel of Darkness was released in 2003. This was the last game that Core Design made in terms of Tomb Raider. And it was the first Tomb Raider game on PlayStation 2, so it was the next-gen Tomb Raider. And the game had a much stronger focus on narrative. So it introduced subtitles and cutscenes within the cutscenes and FMV sequences for the first time. And mostly the other accessibility features carried over, except for Croft Manor, because Lara was on the run from the very beginning, so she didn't have a chance to go to Croft Manor. And she was actually running around Paris, which is kind of fun. The first screenshot here shows off the subtitles and how they were implemented. And I just put the second one in because I thought it'd be fun to put a picture of Lara raiding the Louvre. And a funny story, the Mona Lisa, which is very difficult to see right there, but actually has a photoshopped face of the composer from the game on it after a very long night out. So if you ever go in the game, you will see that that does not actually look like the Mona Lisa. So after Angel of Darkness released in 2003, the franchise was handed over to the sister studio of Core Design, which was us, Crystal Dynamics. And so it made the shift from the UK over to Northern California. And we were best known at the time for the Gex and Legacy of Kain franchises. So the first Tomb Raider release was actually Tomb Raider Legend from Crystal Dynamics. And this slide just showcases the box art for Legend, Anniversary, and Underworld, which was our first trilogy. So in Legend, we wanted to put our own, our own footprint on the game. But obviously, anytime you're taking such an iconic character, you need to make sure that it still feels like the character. It still feels like the series, and that would become even more important in the reboot in 2013. So the core pillars of the game, the combat, traversal and exploration, and puzzle solving, all remained at the heart of Tomb Raider Legend. There was more of an emphasis on fluid traversal and chaining together acrobatic moves, but the big additions this time were introducing multiple difficulty settings, and there was also a combat option. All of the combat until the 2013 reboot was actually lock-on, so Lara would take out her guns and auto-aim at anything, and these options just allowed like different ways to toggle between enemies and so on. But again, they were adding more features. Tomb Raider Anniversary added another couple of features. This was a reimagining of the 1996 title, so we were already 10 years from the first game's release. And it was just slightly reworked narrative and puzzles, but it incorporated some of the elements of Legend. The big thing that they added was having an option to turn on or off manual grab. So in the classic games, if you jumped and latched onto a ledge, you would have to hold a button for the duration you were on that ledge. So if you're sitting there thinking, where am I going to go? You're holding onto that button, holding it down. And this introduced the ability to jump, and if you wanted the manual grab on, she'd just sit there and hang out versus having to keep that button pressed. And there was also an option to include hint icons for interactive inputs in case you forgot, how to interact with what in the environment. So Tomb Raider Underworld added even more. There was a field assistance. So basically, Lara was carrying around a PDA, and it had the ability to give her hints whenever the player wanted. So, it wasn't this system that would spoil the fun for you if you weren't looking for it. You would go into the menu, you'd navigate there, and then you'd have the opportunity to get hints to solve puzzles or to figure out where you were going next. And it also included a sonar map, which was really interesting. And it made it easier to find hidden items. If you've played the Tomb Raider games, collectibles and secrets and all of that are really at the core of the franchise. And sometimes they can be very difficult for people like me, and I am a completionist, to find all of them. And player tailoring is actually the really interesting one. This was, I feel, a precursor to Shadow's difficulty settings. And I'll just show these on the next slide. So this slide showcases the player tailoring menu, which allowed for the health, enemy health, ammunition capacity, Lara's damage, and the time for saving grabs to all be altered independent of one another. So you can see this is kind of like the first time that we tried something similar to what was done in Shadow. And this is what the sonar map looked like. So you can see with all of the foliage and all of the textures and everything removed, it's actually easier to see the terrain. And so you could see like little nooks and places that maybe something would be hidden or things that points of interest that maybe you couldn't see otherwise. So this was a really interesting, nothing had ever been done in the other games. And I guess it's kind of similar to survival instinct in the newer games, but this was very unique for the time. All right, so now we're going to talk about the reboot trilogy. So this is where I came on. I came on to the franchise with Tomb Raider in 2011 for the reboot. And this slide shows the 3 key art images for the reboot trilogy, which began in 2013. So at the same time that the team was developing Underworld, there was actually a splinter team that was working on the Tomb Raider reboot. And the idea was to create an entirely new take on the character, but that it would still obviously be Lara. She'd still be the same, independent, intelligent adventurer. She would just be younger. We'd be telling her origin story. And so Underworld is really when the studios started to think about accessibility in terms of more than just difficulty settings or very basic subtitles. And a lot of that has to do, and we have to give thanks to Carrie Hatner, who began to champion audio accessibility through subtitles at Crystal Dynamics in 2008 while she was working on that game. And she was a producer at the time. The subtitles in Underworld were significantly easier when compared to the 2013 reboot, because Lara was much more of a loner, and she had these quippy one-lines, versus in the reboot, she's younger, she has a lot more social connections, and so there was a lot more work, ambient dialogue. Sometimes there would be cinematics with 5+ characters, and so the subtitles were a lot more difficult to implement. So Kari started looking into research guidelines outside of the industry. She also looked at the BBC, I know that was mentioned earlier, and looked at how they did both that and closed captioning. And this led to a new subtitle system that it had markup for the duration of the text. It had the color of the font could be changed. There was the addition of italics, and it could display multiple strings of text at one time. So it was a much more robust system than the first time. And these two slides illustrate what the difference is between the two games, so Tomb Raider Underworld and Tomb Raider the reboot, the 2013 reboot. So on the first slide, there are actually two speakers, but you can't tell, that there's no attribution, there's no color difference or so on. In the second one, you've got both character name tags and the color difference, so it made quite a big difference. And I will reiterate this later, but I do want to say, we are very aware that it is the best way to get feedback and to get accurate feedback is to go to the source. And that's something we really hope to do in the future. At the time, she basically would turn off the sound and look for progression blockers to make sure that there wasn't anything that was going to keep a deaf person from playing through the game. And so she actually was able to find some of those things. And so if you look at this slide, this is where she started to add some select closed captioning in. And this is early in the game, in the 2013 game, where she basically had to defend herself against wolves. And if you didn't hear the wolves howling, then they just attacked you out of nowhere, and there was no way that you could have been prepared. It was basically that progression blocker. So after finding any of those and implementing select closed captioning, she would also go through and look for things that would add to the experience, things that added narrative context or the parts that needed to be emphasized. So the subtitles and the closed captioning were received pretty well. Any complaints focused on letterboxing being a bit big or so on. But it actually received a news editor's choice from Josh Strub, who's a deaf gamer from Daggers, the accessibility site. And the positive coverage really made us want to keep doing this, to continue the accessibility work. So looking outside of just the audio, the closed captioning and the subtitles, what else was new was Survival Instinct. Survival Instinct was basically it was a visual manifestation of Lara's intelligence and ability to survey an environment. So basically the player could click a button and anything that they could interact with in the environment would be highlighted yellow. It would also trigger tips from Lara, so if you were in the middle of a puzzle and you hit Survival Instinct, she would say something that would give you a bit of a clue. And it would show an objective beacon that would shoot up into the sky. So if you're wandering around these hubs, which were very large, we introduced these huge hub spaces in the reboot, it would tell you which direction to go. All right, so I wanted to take this time to also introduce one of the community members who I absolutely adore. So when I came onto the team in 2011, the game was already quite a bit underway. And so, I continued my accessibility efforts on more of a small personal scale. So I was working directly with members of our communities to provide more insights and to get information that I could hopefully take into the future. And this is when I met one of our core members of the fan community. Her name is Kate Sykes. And she's a mega fan. She's been a fan since, I think, going back to just such a young age as a child. She's also one of our official Lara Croft cosplay ambassadors, and she's official Tomb Raider webmaster. And I met her at an event in the UK. I think it was an EGX really early on, and she has cerebral palsy. And after watching her demo the game, we sat and had a really good conversation about, what the difficulties were, where there could be rooms for improvements. And she shared that she'd never been able to finish a game on her own because using the controller was so difficult. So we took this information, we commissioned a custom controller from her, from Ben Heckendorn, who I knew about from my time working at Game Informer, because we just really didn't want her to miss out on the reboot. This was like this new era of Tomb Raider that she was so excited about. And so she was able to actually complete the game with a little bit of help in some of the more intense action sequences. But she actually finished a Tomb Raider game. She finished a game for the first time. And while this was great, and it was something that we were very proud of, we knew that the accessibility had to be approached on a much more broad level than that. And so in these pictures, you can see Kate with the controller, and you can see how we modified it. They put the triggers and the shoulder buttons onto the top of the controller, and then shaved off part of the bottom and put the non-skid on there so that it was easier for her to use on her tray. So there was definitely some learnings from Tomb Raider 2013. We got a lot of feedback about the QTEs, the QuickTime events. Some people just didn't like them. Some people, found them basically progression blockers. People brought up the controller customization, and traditionally, Tomb Raider combat has been a bit more isolated. There would be pockets of isolated combat, and they would also include things like dragons and T-Rexes and all of that sort of stuff. So there was a lot more combat in Tomb Raider in the 2013 game. And that actually had some classic fans, wanting to, some classic fans didn't quite make the curve into the reboot because they were not used to that. So they requested that we would balance that better in the next game. And it was interesting. Classic fans also thought that the puzzles and traversal were too easy. So we were getting feedback on both ends of the spectrum. We were getting people saying that some things were too difficult and some things were too easy. And this is where we started getting the seeds of player choice. So it's like, we're not going to be able to make our fans happy if we push to one side or the other. We're going to have to diversify and make options available for everyone. So in Rise of the Tomb Raider, player choice really became a large focus for us. We expanded the crafting system and the skill tree so that people could level up their Lara as they liked. If they wanted to focus on different types of, if they wanted to focus their skills in traversal or exploration or combat or so on, they could do that and level her up as desired. Hearing that fans wanted a better balance of combat, we also introduced stealth gameplay, and this inherently made the game more accessible because you could, for the most part, avoid combat and be very tactical about it. Sit up in the trees and analyze things and then make your move. There definitely were sequences still that had combat that you couldn't skip because of, for a narrative reason they were in there. But it did appeal. It appealed to the classic gamers who didn't want to do the all-out firefights. And when it came to subtitles and closed captions, we introduced more options. The subtitles added the option to disable colors because some fans just wanted them they wanted them just plain white. Obviously, adding the option to turn them off helped any issues pertaining to color blindness. And we also allowed a decrease in the opacity of the letterbox and added a drop shadow. And so you can see here, this is an example in this screenshot of the opacity being dropped in the letterboxing and just having the white text on. So it's a little bit more on the simple scale, but those options were available. You could go back to the old system if you desired. We weren't taking away any options, we were adding more. And I really like this quote because I feel like this quote basically sums up everything that we felt about the game. It was great progress, but we had a ways to go. And the quote says, it's from the accessibility review from Daggers. It says, "These features make the subtitles in Rise of the Tomb Raider the best subtitles I've seen in the gaming industry. It's just unfortunate the level of accessibility does not exist across all forms of physical impairment." So we knew that there was more that we could do, and we were excited about that. So I'm going to start talking about Shadow of the Tomb Raider. I know that was a lot of context, but I feel like the journey to the accessibility is actually quite important. So internally, we had accessibility champions at IDOS Montreal and at Crystal Dynamics. So for context, IDOS Montreal actually took Shadow of the Tomb Raider as lead developer. Crystal Dynamics assisted, but for the first 2 games, it was roles reversed. They had contributed and assisted us, and so this was their chance to shine. And so the internal accessibility champions were people from outsourcing. We had a programmer. We had several programmers. And eventually, once we got the pitch through, even the head of studio at IDOS Montreal also became a champion for this and wants to work towards becoming known as an accessible studio. Okay, so this is just a quote that I wanted to read from one of the team members who was one of the internal strike team members, and it's about why he wanted to contribute to accessibility options. And he says, "It was important to offer accessibility features because not only is it part of the franchise DNA, but also giving the same experience to the most players we can was really rewarding. During the development, I discovered we had so many colorblind developers in our team, and just choosing a bad color combo could degrade their experience. Furthermore, adding accessibility features not only help people with disabilities, but improve the games for everybody." So that's a fairly common sentiment and logic behind that. So looking at the research for these features began in 2016. And because there was already an excellent foundation for subtitles, which were praised both in 2013 and Rise, the team asked, what more can we do? What are the next steps that we can take? Essentially, they were closing out the trilogy, and a lot of the main mechanics had been developed already, so it left a little bit more room to expand into new territory. So deciding what features would be implemented came about from a large amount of research, and that included fan feedback, so taking feedback from disabled gamers who spoke out on forums, on reviews, and social media. Learning from events and watching people play. I would often interact as a community manager. I'd often interact with people at events and ask them questions, ask for feedback, and so on. We would also look at industry peers, and what was the best practice for us was looking at industry peers within the genre, within action-adventure games, because we knew that a similar style game would mean that those types of accessibility features would translate well. And I think it's really important here. I've heard this echoed a couple of times now, but there's really no room for pride in accessibility in terms of you should be looking to others for inspiration, and not even just looking to them passively, but going to them and asking them. It's not about competing against each other when it comes to accessibility. We want disabled gamers to win, and to do that, we all kind of have to work together. So taking inspiration from each other is, I think, a fantastic thing. So moving forward with these accessibility issues, there was really no issue with internal politics. And frequently I feel like this is the case with developers. I don't think I've ever talked to a developer who's anti-accessibility. Most often it's just a concern of time and resources and not starting the process early enough, which is something that across the industry needs to be resolved. So the team at IDOS Montreal went about implementation in a really intelligent way that focused on smart choices as a foundation to ensure the success of the initiative. So the development team started by asking what's the mission? And the mission was to establish the desired features as primary features, not sub-features, which would be worked against from pre-production. And interesting enough, so this was the first time in the trilogy that I was working with a dev team that actually wasn't local to me. So Crystal Dynamics, I could go over and talk to people in their desk. And I was now working with a team in Montreal. And we didn't realize early on in 2016 that we were actually parallel pathing this. So they were putting together their own proposals, and then I was doing mine at Crystal Dynamics. And later, they would actually come together and be really important, that it was multidisciplinary. That would actually become very relevant. One moment, I appear to have lost my mouse. Oh well. Okay, so we'll go on to the feature list. So after the extensive research, it became clear that there were two areas that we needed to improve, aiding gamers with cognitive and physical disabilities, especially anything that catered to lacking fine motor skills. And this really helped shape our experience moving forward. And the other mantra that kind of shaped these features was the idea of player choice, which again, that's why it's in the title, that's why we mention it so much, the idea of just giving players of any type choice. So the ideal list was curated to maximize reach while minimizing weight on production. And because production was not bought in at this point, all the research and so on had been done sort of with this strike team on their own time, it was really important to make sure that it was easy and airtight to present. So the list that initially was pitched included the subtitles and closed captioning, alternate configuration for one-handed play, a camera follow, which would be really important for that, a puzzle assist, which again, because the game is very action, it has a lot of puzzles. That's something that we felt could help from a cognitive standpoint. And auto pass, this is something that our games have these, what we call OMS sequences, which we have now changed to Oh My Stars, but it didn't really mean that at first. But they have these sequences that are like these giant runouts, these big action scenes where something's exploding and you have to do these really quick jumps and dodging things and so on. And they're very cinematic, but they can also be very difficult to complete. So having the ability to auto pass something if it was failed several times was something we're interested in doing. And we were also interested in adding speed settings, so being able to actually slow down the game and adjust that. That was something we wanted to give a try. So the pitch itself, this is a quote from Virginie, one of the producers there. And she said, "We were working on a third opus. We had a very mature game design and knew rapidly what could be done. Now we had to be very smart about the features because production was not in the loop yet and we had to sell them on the plan. Developing and implementing accessibility is not easy. It is another layer of not easy over game dev." So this also came into consideration when we came up with the ideal feature list. So in her pitch, she included statistics from the Able Gamers Foundation talking about, how many people these would benefit. They shared the goal, a breakdown of each feature, and included a production timeline. And the timeline basically had everything broken down week to week in terms of the resources and technology that would be needed and who would need to touch what in order to make it, full-fledged. And this is another quote that I just wanted to read because it's really, I think it captures the difficulties of developing something like this, especially if these features are a little bit more foreign to members of the dev team. So she said, "Even though we had all the support, because after this initial pitch, everybody, including the studio head, were very excited about these accessibility features." She says, "Even though we had all the support, it's a very different thing in the heat of production. The accessibility team needs to be a sort of task force, constantly pressuring the team. I remember we were running late and pushing to start work, and a producer told me, 'Virginie, the damn AI and combat are up in flame. How can I allow resources to accessibility features at the moment?' And he was right. Even though accessibility is important, it should not jeopardize the team's ability to ship high-quality content." And this is, I think, the really, really important part here. Eventually, these 2 points won't be considered as opposites to one another if we start designing them from the start. That's the point. We must push for the development of accessible features, not only for complementary accessibility options. So I just love the way that she frames that, keeping in mind that the features from the very core of what you're designing are accessible, instead of trying to find a way to alter them to make them more widely accessible. So I'm going to run through the final accessibility menu now. There were some things that carried over from the games before it, but we had a lot of new stuff with Shadow of the Tomb Raider. And it was actually really important to put it in a menu that was labeled accessibility. We wanted to give visibility and to use and broadcast the word accessibility. So we were able to get in the camera follow. We added a new aim mode, which is tap versus holding. You could change your weapon aim to either the right or left stick. And we made it so these repeated button presses, the quick time events, you could either tap or hold. And crank controls, we would often have things like wheels that would need to be turned, and you'd have to rotate the stick around constantly. You could choose to rotate it, or you could push directionally. So we were making the controls a little bit easier in that regard. And this is just a quick look at the accessibility menu. So the final features when it comes to language, we had the subtitle options for off, on with color, and on without color. We had environmental subtitles, which would basically have, Lara would go through these big hubs, and it would have subtitles for all these ambient conversations going around. It was another option. And then we also did have closed captioning with all of those sound effects, musical cues, and so on. And the difficulty settings, now this is the thing that a lot of people got excited about, and it's one of the things I'm most excited about to share. It became our biggest success, I think, within the accessibility features, because it addressed both physical and cognitive spectrums. It also addressed new fans and old fans and just all types of different play styles. Again, this was about player choice. This is another quote from Virginia that I think is really interesting. She says, specific to addressing cognitive impairments, it was important to the team not to put it as an obvious feature. It wasn't in an accessibility menu. It was in the difficulty section. We didn't want to treat anybody like a kid. It was an option to make puzzles easier, but it was also for those who prefer action to slowing down the pace of the game. So, putting it within a difficulty setting was something that was really important to her. Let's see. So we actually see these variety of difficulty settings as sort of like the future of accessibility, because it is giving players choice. And this is what it looked like. So essentially what you could do is you could choose combat, exploration and traversal, and puzzle, and puzzle difficulties, and you could set them how you desired. So if you wanted to, you could play combat hard and puzzles on easy. Or if you wanted easy combat and just wanted to focus on challenging yourself when it came to the puzzles, you could do that. So these next few slides are very text heavy. You don't have to read through them all, but I wanted to put them up there in case someone wanted to snap a picture of how it actually broke down. So basically, when it comes to combat, you could do something, if you chose easy, you would have something like aim assist enabled. Enemies would have lower health, ammunition would be more plentiful, and enemies would be outlined in bright yellow. So that made combat quite a bit easier. But if you go all the way up to hard, there's gonna be a lot less ammo. There's no hit markers on the reticle. Enemies locate Lara more easily, and so on. So you have an ability to choose if you really want to go hardcore and make this experience as hard as possible, or if you're not a huge fan of combat, which a lot of classic Tomb Raider fans prefer less combat or easier combat, then you can set it to easy. For exploration and traversal, this one is something that I think was really cool and actually fulfilled a request from a lot of longtime fans in the process. So on easy for exploration and traversal, there was obvious white paint on the critical path. So there was, it made it easier to see where you could and couldn't traverse. So instead of sitting there staring and saying, can I make that jump? You would know you'd be able to make that jump, and it would help you kind of identify how to move through the environment. And there was also longer time on the save, on the grab meter, so if you jump and you slip, you would have a longer time to grab back on before falling. And if you moved up to difficult or in the harder settings, there would be no white path on the white paint on the critical path. The save timer would be significantly shorter. You couldn't use survival instincts, and so this was, a way again to give people the options that they desired. And so you can see here, this is what it looked like, the hard, normal, and easy when it comes to the difficulty of traversal. And this actually made members of what they call the Growl group on the Tomb Raider forums very excited. They're the Get Rid of White Ledges group, and they had been petitioning us for a very long time to make it harder, make traversal harder. And so this allowed, again, the full spectrum. They were able to set traversal to harder, while we were all able to offer an easier experience on the other end of the spectrum. Puzzles was actually probably one of the harder versions, because we didn't want to actually change how you solve the puzzles. We wanted the puzzle solving to be the same across the board. And so what was done is, to make puzzles easier, Laura would give a direct hint for whatever the next step was. Interactive objects would be highlighted in yellow, and then the object that you needed, the absolute next step. So if you look in a room, anything you could interact with would be in yellow, and the thing that was the next step of the process would be in blue. So you'd go up to that, and you'd be able to figure out what to do. And there was also a longer window of opportunity for like timed jumps and so on. And again, if you move into harder Deadly Obsession, which Deadly Obsession is very, very, very hard, there are absolutely no hints by Laura. You can't use survival instincts, and there is a very short window of time for those mechanics, timed mechanics. And this is how it manifested. So you can see easy, normal, and hard in terms of what the puzzles would look like. And we also worked with Tobii eye tracking again. So we worked with Tobii on Rise of the Tomb Raider, and it was a great partnership. We really enjoy working with them. And so the integration with Shadow included extended view, which would basically, if the player looked at the peripheral of the screen, the camera would pan that way. Survival instinct awareness, which essentially if you look at something in the environment, if you can interact with it, then it would be highlighted in yellow. And there was aim at gaze and throw at gaze. And this is what they looked like within the screen. It manifests in this blue reticle. So when it came to promoting the features, we had actually had Mark from Able Gamers out to the studio earlier this year for just a general training and best practice session with our internal strike team at Crystal Dynamics. And one of the biggest pieces of advice that he gave us was to ensure that when we talked about accessibility, that we did it publicly, that we shouted from the rooftops about it, because we wanted fans to know what features we had included. And we also know that that would help raise awareness among other developers, and the hope being then that they follow suit, that they try to meet those standards or improve them in their own games. And so we released this huge blog that basically detailed every part of the accessibility and difficulty features, and we combined it with that messaging of player choice. We put it under that player choice umbrella. And it was picked up, because of that wrapper, it was picked up by a lot of mainstream press, and it was also picked up by a lot of accessibility press. And fans really appreciated the transparency of it. They appreciated that they knew going into the purchase what they would be getting. And so overall, it was a very positive experience. And while getting, press from the mainstream mainstream press is great, ultimately it was the community feedback that meant the most to us. And so when it came to launch, we collected this huge series of tweets from the community that were talking about the accessibility features and what it meant and so on, and sent them to the internal strike teams. And it was very validating and encouraging. And it was also very educational, because obviously there's still areas that we can improve and we want to improve. So we were able to write that down for the future. So I have a couple of questions that I solicited ahead of time, and I'm just going to run through them quickly. This question is, which features were the easiest and hardest to implement? Were there any that were particularly hard or easier than you expected them to be? So that's actually hard to say, because when we selected the features, they were done, the features were chosen because they already supplied the proof of concept and knew that they could get that workload done. So from the very beginning, what they chose was very doable. A couple of notes from the devs, though. The subtitles were easy because basically they just needed to polish the closed captioning. They already had that very strong foundation. The aim assist was really easy because the engine is very mature. Evidently, the white paint for the traversal, the easy traversal mode, was a pain because they had to go in and change and swap a lot of art assets to make that work, but I think that it was well worth it. And for the puzzle difficulty settings, that actually required a lot more voiceover work because you have to do different hints for each difficulty level. More explicit hints for the easier settings and less explicit hints as you got harder. So they said it actually tripled the initial number of lines for the puzzle settings. Were there any things you wanted to implement but were not able to? If so, what were they and why? Auto pass, the auto pass, that was one that we had wanted to implement but didn't get to it. It was a resource issue, and the reason basically we would have to ensure that the player, by skipping something, didn't miss out on the narrative within that segment. And so it required, a lot of resources to figure out how that would be communicated. And so that didn't unfortunately make it, but it's something that's great to look forward to in the future. Let's see. We also didn't have true or full one-handed play, which they said was just a timing issue, and the speed settings allowing the game to run slower. So they knew from the beginning that this was going to be a really expensive feature if it wasn't designed properly, and there wasn't a uniform agreement on how to implement it at the time. The reason that they weren't able to get it to work out is because it was really jarring to go from a slower play speed in the game and then into a cinematic that ran at a normal speed. So there were just issues there that they weren't able to resolve in time, but they said perhaps with a stronger code base and approaching it from the foundation of the game, that might be something that we're able to look to in the future. If you were to go back in time and start developing what if anything would you do differently? Now this is a big one, and I said I'd touch on it again. We would absolutely bring the community in. When we had Mark out to the studio, he made us aware of the resource of the disabled gamers available. There's actually a lot of them in San Francisco, which is great for Crystal Dynamics and something that we hope to take advantage of in the future. But we know that there's no substitute. Turning off the sound on the game to check subtitles and closed captioning is obviously not the real thing. But hopefully in the future that's something that we'd be able to do, and we absolutely recommend that if utilize the resources and bring in the gamers who are going to be using these features. And what tips do you have for developers who want to start implementing more accessibility features? So first thing I would say is create a strike team that can ensure everything is well researched and viable, not only in terms of the production constraints, but within the framework of the game itself. Establishing an accessible foundation is another tip. So accessibility should be built upon. If a team can't implement all the desired accessibility features at once, then you should do what you can and build upon it for the next game. Each release should be like a building block. And you should never be regressing ideally. So if you continue to build up accessible features, then your games are going to become more and more accessible each time. I would suggest positioning things about player choice. As games become more expensive to make, they need to appeal to a wider audience, and allowing for player choice not only allows for customization of controls and difficulty, but it just allows more people to play. And I did have a quote here, but it is not showing for some reason. But I want to end on something that's a little bit more personal. So this is an image of Kate Sykes Van Site, and it was really, really meaningful and personal to hear that because of these accessibility features, Shadow of the Tomb Raider was the first game ever that she was able to complete by herself. And to have started this journey at the beginning of the reboot with her, and then have Shadow be a game that she was able to complete was really, really meaningful. And we hope to have more stories like that in the future. So I know we don't have much time because I took a long time. I took like 43 minutes, sorry. But please come chat with me afterwards. I would love to get more feedback. I would love to hear suggestions, anything along those lines, and talk further. And thank you for listening. Sorry for the jet lag.